How then can we move forward in such wrenching times? The late French Dominican and Cardinal Yves Congar shows one possible path. By any standard, Congar is the most significant ecclesiologist of the 20th century, and likely the greatest single theological influence on the documents of Vatican II. In 1950, he wrote what remains the definitive work on church reform, called True and False Reform in the Church. In that book, he speaks about three types of reform: two true and one false. The first type of reform is what he calls a reform of abuses. This type of true reform works in the realm of already given structures and practices. More pastoral than doctrinal, it seeks a more exacting observance of church discipline. Think of the Council of Trent mandating that bishops live in their dioceses and be present there during Holy Week. The second type of reform is what Congar calls doctrinal revolution. This false reform unacceptably calls into question some aspect of the Church's dogmatic, sacramental, and hierarchical nature. Congar sees Martin Luther as the classic example of such revolutionary reform, even if he's somewhat sympathetic to the concerns that motivated Luther's efforts. The third type of reform, I think, is the most important for our purposes here. It seeks what Congar calls a reform of a state of affairs. The French is état de choses, a mindset, a culture. This culture change, so to speak, is less specific than a reform of abuses. It instead seeks systemic reform and often calls for, in Congar's words, quote, new men and women who aren't prisoners of the system, end quote, who can question the system and find new ways forward. Most deeply, this reform involves a recentering on Christ and his paschal mystery. St. Francis of Assisi is Congar's exemplar of such reform. And I think it's no accident that St. Francis's efforts at reform began before the crucifix at San Damiano. Francis, rebuild my church, which, as you see, is falling into ruins. These are strong words from a strong-willed theologian and churchman in Congar. But I believe that this change of mindset is the most needed type of reform today when facing a crisis of trust. And I think that Vatican II offers a way forward for such ecclesial renewal.